let me explain tonicity. Tonicity has to do tonic, hyper, hypo, or isotonic tonicity has to do with the water content of a cell. Now, so imagine that I have a human cell, and then I put it into a jar or a beaker. It would be a very, very small beaker, but let's assume that that's what I did. And we know that the cell likes to be at 0.9% of salt. So the cell is that. We're going to say the cell is where it likes to be. And then we put it into an isotonic solution. Iso means the same. So the tonicity of the water around the cell is the exact same of the tonicity of the water in the cell. Now, because of that, no osmosis is going to take place. Everything is exactly as it likes to be. It's in homeostasis. That is good. However, if I put that cell in a hypotonic solution, hypo means that there's not enough. It means low. And so a hypotonic solution means that there is not as much salt and electrolytes in that solution as there is in the cell. Therefore, water is going to want to go into the cell until the water content relative to the salt content of that cell has become equal with the solution around it. And that is going to lead to the swelling of the cell. And it could actually swell so much that just like a water balloon, it pops, the cell bursts. This can cause cell death, which is very bad. If then lastly, I put it into a hypertonic solution, that means there is more salt in the solution outside of the cell than there is in the cell. And so water is going to want to leave the cell. That is exactly what I was talking about with the ocean water. Ocean water is hypertonic. Now, water would want to leave that cell until there's so little water within that cell that it is equal to the salt content of the solution outside of the cell. That causes the cell to shrink and shrivel and dry up just like a raisin. And that is pretty bad. Now, when we drink still water, that still water is hypotonic. Now, we usually consume much sodium in the food that we eat. You know, we use salt as a seasoning. It's in processed foods especially, and fast food. I mean, it's in all sorts of food. Like all sorts of food is salted. Even desserts and bread, things that you wouldn't think have salt in them. The salt plays an important component in their flavor. There's salt in everything. And usually if you have salt on like a French fry or something, that is going to be relatively hypertonic. There's going to be a lot of salt with a very low amount of water in that food. There is water in food, by the way, in fruits and vegetables especially, but as well as in meat. We already discussed that, lean muscled tissue contains a high amount of water. It's the same for animals, right? That's why you can get a juicy steak or you could get a dry piece of steak that's not very good. There's water in our food. Most of the time, though, the food, again, the salt relative to that water is going to be hypertonic. And so that's why most of the time it's okay for us just to consume plain drinking water without added electrolytes, because everything's going to, balance out. We say that the RDA for sodium is 2,300 milligrams. Now, what that RDA, or the recommended daily allowance, the reason it was set at that level is to replace the amount of lost sodium. That's why the RDA is set what it is just to replace our losses. And on average, an American adult is going to lose about 2,300 milligrams of sodium each day. Now, the American Heart Association, I believe, actually recommends less. It would be 1,500. The American Heart Association recommends 1,500 milligrams of salt intake a day, but that has to do with, again, hypertension, high blood pressure, trying to lower that high blood pressure. So for most people, you can think 2,300, but again, for athletes, you're going to need more. Athletes and people who are training and moving and running and lifting weights and being outside in a hot climate, you are going to lose more sodium than the average American adult. So you can consume more sodium. You need to consume the amount of sodium in a day that you lost in a day. That's the goal. So if you're sweating a lot, you need to consume more sodium. Now, all of that, I apologize, was a very long buildup for me to tell this example of oftentimes when people complete a marathon, the very end of their marathon, 26.2 miles, you can imagine obviously that they have sweat a lot. They have lost a lot of water. They've been very, very physically active for hours on end. 4 or 5 hours is very common for a marathon, but even if you're very, very fast, it's going to be probably about 3 hours. The fastest marathon is like 2 hours. So you've been very, very physically active for hours on end. It's worse if the climate is hot. You would think that this person would be very dehydrated, right? However, oftentimes we will look at somebody who has just completed a marathon and they will appear overhydrated, meaning that their cells have swelled up as if they were placed into a hypotonic solution, which is weird. That's not what we'd expect to see when somebody finishes a marathon. Now, the reason for that is because many people during a marathon just consume plain water. They've lost a lot of salt and they've only replenished it with plain water. And so they're consuming this hypotonic beverage and they're not replacing their electrolyte losses. And so there's a very small amount of water in their blood, but there's a very high amount of water in their body cells. So this can lead to a ton of terrible, terrible outcomes. It can actually lead to something called rhabdomyolysis, which is the rapid breakdown of muscle cells. The breakdown of muscle cells, rhabdomyolysis, is common when you're doing a bout of physical activity that is more than what you've trained for. It's a very, very bad thing. And really what it is when the amount of, waste products from these damaged muscle cells become too much for your kidneys to handle. So it's not that being dehydrated leads your muscle cells to die, though again, it could if they burst and died. But what that's going to mean is if you have a low blood volume, then it's going to more easily overcome your kidneys, the amount of waste products in your body, and that could lead to sickness. Again, it can also lead to, if you're not replenishing these electrolytes, heart arrhythmias. It's very, very common for people to have heart attacks after a marathon, even though presumably they're very healthy. It's probably not because there's an occlusion of an artery to the heart, but it's because they have some electrolyte-dependent heart arrhythmia. Very, very bad things can happen in this regard.